I have a confession to make. I am not a psychologist. I'm a philosopher by training, and so I'm sort of in another school, and I don't have to do any data collection or check on whether an
Even
experiment.
though you're a philosopher, you only have 10 minutes.
I know. I know that. I've got my watch. So let me begin by saying one of my specialty actually is business ethics, and I've been teaching the Milgram experiment and running the film in all my undergraduate courses, my graduate courses, my executive education courses for a very long time, because I wanted my students to make this a learning experience. How do they think out of the box? How are they able to take charge? How do they realize that when they're leaders, people are going to follow them, so that they should be the positive models, not the negatives, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it's worked really well. But then a couple of years ago, I was on a golf course, and the woman I was playing with said, well, there's really a problem with the Milgram experiments because the experimental protocol itself is flawed. We've heard a lot about that. So I stopped and thought about that. And it's probably true. And for those of you who have insomnia, the philosophers as well as psychologists have written endlessly about informed consent. So I'm not going to talk about that. But I still would argue, and that's why all of you are here, is because there's something about these experiments that is compelling and revealing and a learning experience despite the flaws. So I suppose I'm a consequentialist. And I appreciate your laying out the law because I have done that also in business ethics. A couple of the other issues and implications that I want to bring out. When I show the original film, which I do, I use the original one. I don't use any of the YouTube ones. Of course, people of all ages say that was the olden days in the 1960s, and this doesn't happen anymore. So, of course, I go back to Berger. Thank bless you, Berger. And then I go to the, has anybody seen the French television mock-up program? Yes. For those of you who haven't, just very briefly, in 2010, a group of, this is bad, by the way, bad data collection, bad experiment, bad informed consent, so just bracket that mindset for a minute. They set up a mock television program and asked people to come and watch, and they set up naive contestants, these were teachers, and then a learner who, of course, was an actor, and then, of course, when the learner missed, the teacher shocked the learner on the stage, and so all the audience saw this person really suffering, and they kept egging the teacher on. Get him again, usually it was a man, up to 450 volts. 82% of these teacher contestants complied, and the audience just loved it. I'll let you work that out yourself. It was called, by the way, Game of Death. If that doesn't give it away, nothing does. But anyway, and of course, there's Rwanda. There's the 2008 U.S. subprime mortgage lenders going along with the urge of their bosses to just lend money to any of us. I hope you haven't suffered that. And then, of course, people forget the borrowers go along as well. They don't check on themselves. They don't check on their financial situation. They just take the advice of some guy who really doesn't know very much. So I find that really striking. Of course, there's good old Enron that keeps business ethics in business, and so on. But a couple of the issues that some of you brought them out. But from these experiments and the replications, we can conclude that still today, most of us go along, even if we studied the Milgram experiments. We are Me Too's, or as Karana from the Harvard Business School puts it, we often act as hired hands. And that is my worry when I try to train leaders in business, that they just go along. And that's the same problem with the lawyers. And we defend ourselves by saying, well, there's certain rules. I'm not disobeying the law. Everybody does it. And we've always done it that way. And if you want to be dramatic, have you all heard of Pitcairn? How many have heard of Pitcairn? Pitcairn is an island. Pitcairn is an island in the Pacific where the shipwrecked British ship mutiny on the Bounty. Yes. It turns out that on Pitcairn, it is the custom for adult males to have sex, I would call it rape, with children under 12. And you can find that online. It's really ghastly. I think, well, that's my bias, obviously. I would call it rape. They call it a local custom, and they've always done it that way. The British government is now trying to try them for that. They say they're not under their jurisdiction. Well, it's a long old story, but it shows how going along and just picking up the custom explains why what I call ordinarily decent people, or ordinarily decent lawyers, ordinarily decent business people do bad things, and my research is focused on that. But finally, I want to focus on something that we haven't talked about much, and Werhane Palmer will talk about this afternoon, and that is there's a lot to be learned from the dialogue itself, and how different teachers react to and interpret what are in general just the consistent cue patterns from the person in authority. And there's a recent study by Dominic Parker, you've probably read that, and we've heard about the 150-volt moment when at least a third of the defectors defect at that moment. So that's the first time, as you know, the learner says, get me out of here, and so on. Get me out of here, I won't be in the experiment anymore. And it's that moment, according to these thinkers, that language that the learner uses that triggers the mindsets of some, obviously not many, of the teachers. And it brings out their sense of self that Jill talked about earlier. And they're able then to disengage from the experiment. Now, obviously, not many do, but it tells us something else, that how we use language and how it's interpreted by different audiences. Most of you are teachers, and your students don't all have the same mindset, as you know, but they hear your words in different ways. And I think that's a huge ethical issue of how careful we have to be about what we say. And I was in an earlier session this morning from the Hoffman Library and Jill's paper, and something triggered my thinking. The term obedience that we use to refer to the Milgram experiment is itself a socially constructed and morally laden term. What would happen if we titled this session and the Milgram work as, for example, resistance? Would our thinking, would our experimentation, would our conclusions be different? I don't know the answer, but I know they've been working on that. And I think it's interesting to think about how we construct language as well as the whole experiments themselves. Thank you.